Hello, everybody. Welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, right now, as we do this program in Washington, D.C., the House of Representatives are hearing arguments pro and con for bringing articles of impeachment against the current president. And the Democratic Counsel made his arguments this morning. And this afternoon, the Republican Counsel will be presenting the other side on why there's not enough evidence to impeach the president. In listening to some of the testimony, especially what little bit I heard on the other side, it's almost like it's Homer Biden that is up for impeachment rather than Donald Trump. Now, is the president going to be impeached? Well, majority rules. And I think the House will come down on a party line of producing a bill of impeachment. Now, will he be convicted? Well, that has to go to the Senate in January. And this is a Senate which has a Republican majority. And again, the majority rules. And I think the president will be found not guilty. But it'll be on his record that he would be the third president to be impeached, following Andrew Johnson in 1868, Bill Clinton in 1998, and Donald Trump in the year 2020. I think this will be a major factor in the upcoming presidential election. Well, it's pretty obvious that the Republicans feel that Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee. And I think that is why the president was getting as much, if you will, dirt on his potential opponent. And when he couldn't get it on his opponent himself, he's gone after his son. Well, it's always been sort of an unwritten rule that when you're campaigning politically, you go after your opponent. You don't go after their family. And Trump, by going after Homer Biden, who's Joe Biden's son, has more or less violated that rule, has violated all kinds of rules. Well, Trump will not be removed from office. That'll have to be done by the voters in November of 2020, which, if anybody has any common sense or half a brain in their head, that's what they will do. Of course, Trump has his supporters. You got your rednecks and a few people that put loyalty to the Republican Party ahead of what's good for the country. But I think overall, I think the country realizes, the majority of the country realizes that they made a big mistake in 2016. Of course, you go back to 2016, we didn't have a heck of a choice. Neither candidate was popular. And, it was elect the worst or elect the most terrible. And in this case, due to the Electoral College, the most horrible won the election. Now, would Hillary have been a good president? No. And I don't think the country wanted to go through 4 more years of the Clintons and their marital problems. And I think that was a big factor in probably electing Donald Trump. And another big reason was that a lot of people that had turned out to support Barack Obama sat on their hands. A number of your African Americans couldn't buy into Hillary. And they said, well, why vote? Didn't bother showing up. And I think a lot of Hispanics, a lot of the your labor union members, they didn't see any point in it. Hillary came across, as Trump did, as a couple of phonies. And it was rather evident at one time, one photo op she did on her campaign, I believe it was in Keene, New Hampshire, where she was having coffee with a group of truckers. And she very, very clearly was uncomfortable. In other words, she is used to hobnobbing with the very wealthy. In fact, the Clintons and the Trumps used to be good friends. So You know, it was a very poor choice that we had in 2016. In 2020, we're going to do a lot better. And I think the Democratic Party is going to do a lot better. In 2016, the Democratic Party National Committee had to change. The chairperson, who was the Congresswoman from Florida, was a very, very strong Hillary supporter. And she used the power of her office as chairman of the Democratic National Committee to more or less cut off any competition to Hillary. Well, the one person, of course, she couldn't cut off was Bernie Sanders. But Bernie's not a Democrat. Bernie never was a Democrat, even though he's running for the Democratic nomination. Bernie is what we'd call a progressive. When he first came to Vermont, and when he first came to Vermont, he lived in the Brattleboro area. You know, it was the big back to the soil movement and all that. And Bernie Sanders arrived here in Peter Diamond Stone, and they created what they call the Liberty Party. And Bernie ran for Congress and he lost, and he ran for governor and he lost, and he ran for state senator and he lost. Well, Bernie and his wife divorced. Bernie moved to Burlington, and he remarried a lady by the name of Jane Curtis, who was a divorcee herself. And Bernie still, had the fire in the belly. And so he ran for mayor of Burlington. He ran against the Democratic incumbent. And he ran on a newly organized party called the Progressive Party. And of course, Bernie was elected by 12 votes, mayor of Burlington. And he was reelected. I think he served something like 3 or 4 terms as mayor of Burlington. Probably not that many. He probably served 2 or 3, because the mayor in Burlington serves for 3 years, as contrasted with 2 here in Rutland and Montpelier and Barrie and other cities. Well, he went from being the mayor of Burlington, he had national ambitions. And the first time he ran for Congress, he was defeated. But Bernie bounced back, ran for Congress again, and this time he was elected. And he served as our congressman until such time as Jim Jeffords retired. And then he ran for Jeffords' seat in the Senate, and of course he won that. He had the endorsement of the Democratic Party, even though he was not officially a member of the Democratic Party. And of course, when he made his bid for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, he tapped into that segment of the Democratic Party that was very, very concerned about Hillary being the candidate. In fact, I was looking up some information the other day, and I was really surprised that in the Democratic primary vote, Bernie carried 22 states. So he did a little bit better than I thought he did. I knew he had carried some major states like Michigan, which Hillary had counted on. He went up to Michigan, he got the labor vote, carried Michigan. Of course, he won New Hampshire overwhelmingly, as well as the home state of Vermont. And getting out in the Midwest, everybody was really surprised when he carried Michigan. But then he went on to carry Wisconsin and a few other states in the West. He carried Wyoming. I don't think he carried Nevada. I think he lost that. Of course, he lost in California, where much of the liberal movement in California decided to stick with Hillary. But Bernie did very, very well in the Democratic primary in 2016, even though he wasn't a Democrat. But he bucked the system, and he came close to pulling it off. Well, as a result of that, the leadership in the Democratic National Committee has changed. And a congressman from Minnesota is now the Democratic chair, Tom Perez. And he is following the playbook set up by Howard Dean, our former governor, when he was Democratic National Chair. And he's carrying it a little bit further. Not only are the Democrats going to campaign in every state, which Hillary did not do in 2016, there were a number of states she took for granted. A major state was Wisconsin, for one, which went to Trump. Hillary never bothered campaigning there, nor did she campaign very heavily in Minnesota, and some of the other states in the Mississippi Valley. And as a result of that, many of the states in the center of the country supported Donald Trump. Well, Perez comes in, he's elected Democratic National Chair, and he says, well, we're going to revert back and we're going to do what we did when Howard Dean was the Democratic Chair and we elected Barack Obama. And we saw the results in what we call the off-year election that took place in 2018. The Democrats regained control of the House and picked up, I think, something like 7 governorships around the country, 7 or 9, I think it was 7. And in some of these off-year elections, for example, elected a Democratic senator from Alabama, which was very, very strongly Republican. But a lot of that was due because the Republicans were running a individual who had too many, was obviously a racist, and was very much opposed by the female vote. What elected a Democratic senator in Alabama was a large turnout of African American women, turnout that Hillary didn't have in 2016. So we move ahead. The Democrats control the House of Representatives. A vote to impeach is going to be coming up this week. I think it's going to pass because the majority rules. And then we'll go on to the Senate, and there the Senate will not convict. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who was a Republican, he put a stay on a lower court order which required Mr. Trump to show his tax returns to the investigating committee in the House. And the lower courts ruled that he had to, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in a one-man decision, overturned that decision, put a stay on that, and said that it was not necessary for Donald Trump to turn over his tax returns to the House Intelligence Committee. So he's going to manage to ride that out. But you know, when he gets out of office, there's a very, very good chance that what is going to send him to prison are what's on his tax returns, that he has swindled the federal government out of a lot of money as he swindled a lot of other people. I think some of these commercials we are on television for some of the people seeking the Democratic nomination, particularly Tom Steyer. He hits the nail right on the head. He says Trump is a fraud. He's a phony. Bernie Sanders in his commercial, Donald Trump is the most crooked president in the history of the United States. Both correct. Both correct. And around the world, there's a lot of disrespect for the office of President of the United States right now that was not there before the current incumbent. And I think the best example of that was the recent 70th anniversary of NATO that was held in London. And of course, Trump went over there and made a total ass out of himself, as usual. And rather than stick around for the final party that the leaders of the NATO nations had, he left for home early, made a quick exit. One of the big things that he missed in England, the Prime Minister, who is running, Boris Johnson, who is in a tough re-election bid, did not want to meet with Trump because Trump is very, very, very unpopular in Europe and particularly in Great Britain. And for Mr. Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister, who wants to keep the job, had he appeared with Mr. Trump, the chances are pretty good that his days as Prime Minister would be over. So he refused to meet with Trump. And Trump did meet with some other leaders that he tried addressing down or making fun of or whatever you want to say. Well, anyway, when Trump left early, the other leaders got together and they had their big party. And what did they do? Why, they made fun of the President of the United States. That is the first time that leaders of other nations have made fun of the President of the United States. And it shows how much regard they have for the individual we have now. I think every leader, with the possible exception, of course, of Mr. Putin, because Trump leaves, he won't have his puppet there anymore. Little Chop Chop in North Korea, because he won't have Big Stoop to totally outmaneuver anymore. For the President of Turkey, Erdogan, he won't have a fellow dishonest cutthroat in office anymore. Certainly for the Crown Prince of Arabia, because he'll have to account for the kidnapping and butchering of an American citizen. And a few of the other thugs around the world, the President of the Philippines, and a few other of these people that don't deserve to be in public office, including the President of Brazil, who's modeled himself after Trump. At no time in our history has the President of the United States been held up to ridicule by other world leaders. The office has been treated with respect, but we don't have it with the current incumbent. And even though he'll be impeached in the House and found not guilty in the Senate, the final decision will be up to the voters November 2020 to get this country back on track. Now, we're starting to get phone calls from various candidates seeking the Democratic nomination. And I know I got a call last evening at home, person wanting to know if I'd participate in a poll. I said, sure, why not? Well, this particular call was sponsored by Mr. Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, who was seeking the Democratic nomination, really in some ways seeking to buy it. Well, I told the person, you know, would I vote for Bloomberg? I said, no, if I had any say in it, I'd be supporting Joe Biden. Well, she tried to persuade me, well, what's wrong with this? I said, nothing's wrong with Mr. Bloomberg. He's got some good ideas. But he's not the man we need right now to be the President of the United States. Well, would you support him on any kind of a ticket? And I said, no, the ticket I'm supporting will be Joe Biden for president and the junior senator from California, Kamala Harris, for vice president. And I told her the reasons why. First of all, Biden, 77, rather old to be president, but he'll only be a one-term president. But he is a unifier. And what we need right now is somebody to bring the country back together. To be able to, as we say, reach across the aisle. And to make everybody realize that it's not loyalty to a political party that counts. It's your loyalty to the Constitution of the United States that counts. And I think Joe Biden can do that. And for running mate, I was a strong supporter of Kamala Harris, even though she has dropped out of the presidential race because of lack of funds. And I think she would be a great candidate, great vice president. But more importantly, when Biden steps down after one term, somewhere down the line we're going to have a female president. And it's coming sooner than people think. And I think she would be a great person to be the first woman president of the United States. She's a very intelligent lady. She's been the Attorney General in California, the first female African American to be elected to that post. She's the first female African American to be elected senator from California. So she will have the female vote, which the Democrats need, especially the African American female vote, which made such a difference in 2018. We need that. She also speaks Spanish fluently, which will get the Hispanic vote. Democrats to win, they can't focus on some of your wealthy areas. They've got to reach out across the country. They've got to reach out to the people that supported Obama and then sat on their hands in 2016. And I think a ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I think that would do the trick. Well, we'll find out in July when the Democrats have their national convention in Milwaukee, and we'll see who's nominated. The next Democratic Forum in December is coming up, and we'll see how many people are still standing. You know, the field gets smaller and smaller as we get closer and closer to the days of decision, which will be beginning in a couple of months, starting in Iowa, and then on to New Hampshire, on to South Carolina, on to Nevada, and on and on and on. Well, as we move on, just a couple of days ago, December 7, we celebrated the 78th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Now, the vast majority of people that are alive today, of course, were not around in Pearl Harbor. As a senior citizen, excuse me, I was in the 3rd grade at Christ the King School when Pearl Harbor occurred. And at the time, the United States and Japan were negotiating a peace treaty. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was a total surprise. Somehow or another, our intelligence was not up to the fact that the Japanese were going to pull a fast one on us. And the night before Pearl Harbor, which was on a weekend, by the way, President Roosevelt used to have what he called fireside chat. In those days, of course, we had radio. It was our big source of information. Television was rather limited. In fact, it didn't go much outside New York City or within the confines of Chicago and so forth. And President Roosevelt used to use his Saturday evening fireside chats to reassure the country, and it was almost must listening on Saturday night to hear what the president had to say. And one of the things that came up was our relationship with Japan. And President Roosevelt said, there is no way that Japan will attack the United States. That we have fairly good relations with Japan. They're not the best, but Japan will never attack the United States. Well, of course, just a few hours after that came the Japanese surprise attack. They had moved a large fleet unobserved by the United States. They had taken a route out of Japan. They'd gone what you might call the northerly route through the North Pacific and come in on the Hawaiian Islands from the north. All of our military intelligence and everything else said if the Japanese come, they're going to be coming from the west. They came from the north. And of course, they caught everybody totally by surprise when they hit Pearl Harbor. Over 2,600 and some odd casualties resulted from the attack on Pearl Harbor. And many of those casualties, of course, are buried in the ships that were sunk in Pearl Harbor. Some of our major battleships, the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma. I think the USS New Jersey was there too, went down. Fortunately, well, we lost most of our big battleships. Our aircraft carriers, there were 3 of them, were out at sea. The Kitty Hawk, the Endeavor, and the Franklin were out in the Pacific. And it was around these 3 carriers that we rebuilt our Pacific fleet. There are still a few veterans around who were around at the time of Pearl Harbor, but they are getting fewer and fewer. And the memory of Pearl Harbor, for most Americans, is just something they read about in the history book. On Monday, December 8th, President Roosevelt went before Congress because under the Constitution, a president cannot declare war. It has to be done by Congress. But he went before the Congress, a joint session of Congress, and he made his famous speech that December 7th would be a day that would live in infamy. And he asked for a declaration of war against Japan. And Congress voted unanimously in the Senate and in the House for that declaration of war. On the 9th of December, Nazi Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. And on the 10th, Roosevelt went back to Congress and asked for a declaration of war on Germany and Italy. And again, by unanimous vote, that was granted. The United States, at that time, was rather in a poor position to go to war. Britain had been left alone, more or less, to fight the war in Europe. In Germany, of course, they had defeated France. They occupied France. They occupied Norway, Holland. They had moved into Eastern Europe. The first country they attacked was Poland. They overran the Poles. Down through Czechoslovakia, Austria. And while their Italian allies had invaded Greece, the Greeks were putting up very, very strong resistance. Italy had managed to conquer Albania, but they're having trouble in Greece. So Hitler went to the aid of Mussolini, and the Germans pushed through Greece and extended their occupation into Greece. From Italy, the German and Italian troops, of course, invaded North Africa. France having surrendered, the French, what was left of the French military that was still able to fight in North Africa, was on the side of the Germans. And that is another story that we'll talk about a little bit later, but the African campaign. The United States had come to Great Britain's aid through what we call Lend-Lease. The British Navy was desperately in need of ships. And so 40 destroyers of the United States Navy were turned over to the British. They also needed tanks. The Chrysler Corporation in Detroit manufactured tanks. And these tanks were shipped over to the British in North Africa. They were like our heavy-duty Sherman tanks, but the British called them Centurions. And it were these tanks that the British would use when they battled the German panzers at El Alamein in Egypt, in one of the great tank battles of history that was won by the British and turned the tide in North Africa, along with the fact that the United States, after a dismal start in North Africa, the second start under American officers was much more successful. And with the Battle of El Alamein and American successes in Northwest Africa, and the closing in of the, first of all, the defeat of the French Vichy in North Africa, the gap began to close, and Hitler's hope of a Third Reich that would rule the world was in the process of coming to an end. One of the things that the Germans took over after they defeated the French, they wanted the French Navy. And they ordered the French Navy to bring in all their battleships and so forth into the Mediterranean. And that played into the hands of the British. And so the British made a mass raid on the French Navy and sank most of the French ships, which took the French Navy in World War II totally out of the picture. Well, with that, we're going to be wrapping up here. There's much more we'd like to talk about, and we will at future shows. But with that, may Almighty God in His infinite wisdom continue to bless these United States of America. God love you. Have a great week, and we'll see you all next week.